I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
You know, that right there is an excellent $64 question. How has our world changed? And you're the first one to have ever asked me that.
That's just a taste of my conversation with Andy Lightbody, author of the Terrorism Survival Guide, 201 travel tips on how not to become a victim. Stay tuned for much more on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwardesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
Andy, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, the first thing we really need to clear up is this book seems to come out of nowhere. I mean, last year you and Kathy released a book about jerky, as in beef jerky, how to make it, how to enjoy it. All Things Jerky is the title of this book. And I've looked at your list of books available online. There's all kinds of stuff, outdoors, winter trails. How do we get from there to a counterterrorism advice book?
Well, I'll give you the short story shortest, and that is, I grew up in an outdoor family and have always enjoyed hunting and fishing and being out of doors, and moved myself into a position where I was senior editor of Peterson's Hunting Magazine. I was the editor for all of the outdoor book division for Guns and Ammo. And if you go back historically to the days of Ronald Reagan, when he was president, we had a real threat out there, and it was called the Evil Empire. That was the Soviet Union. So one of my group vice presidents came up with an idea within the Guns and Ammo book division where we put out a lot of what they call one-shots, meaning it was a one-off title.
Okay, so wait a minute. Let's back up and get the time straight. We're not talking about 2 years ago. We're talking about 30 years ago.
Yes, sir. Correct.
Okay, so early 80s, you're the editor of this Peterson Outdoor Guide. So, okay, pick it up.
Okay, and the idea then was that there was really nothing out there for what I call Joe Sixpack, the layperson. And yet Reagan was, of course, touting that the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And we said, well, you know, we're spending all these hundreds of billions of dollars on weapon systems. There's nothing there that people can go to. Sure, you can go to Soldier of Fortune and a few of the others, you know, that I would call fringe.
And why were they fringe? Were they just
because they often directed people that for the mercenary, for the armchair wannabe, James Bond soldiery type person. And we thought that there was a practical approach to taking a look at weapons, weapon systems, figuring out, giving the American public a view into where are all your defense dollars going. And so
it's a valid question.
We put out a what we called a one-shot, and it was called International Combat Arms, the Journal of Defense Technology. And at that point, it broke about every newsstand record in the 36, 37-year history of Peterson Publishing Company. It did so well.
Really? I mean, because it sounds dry and dull.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, we had access. As soon as they decided to do it, they put me on an airplane, and I basically started living at the Pentagon, opening doors to all of the different armed forces, you know, saying, we're not here to tear down everything. We want to report about why do we need something like the V-22 Osprey that we see out at the Gunnison Airport nowadays? In those days, P.X. Kelly, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps, basically told me, said, Andy, we really need this. Our helicopters are old and aged. What is a B-1 bomber? What was the F-17 stealth fighter? All of the new technologies that we were developing that really people didn't have much access to information.
So they take you in a back room and twist your arm and make you swear to secrecy, and there are things you still can't tell me?
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. There's a lot that was shared classified. Most of it, though, was developmental technologies that you could see incrementally coming online. The SDI program, Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. I mean, my gosh, look at what everybody thought Star Wars, it's going to be a joke. But if you look at the technology today, a lot of that is what we're seeing has now become a reality. It's here. And it's kind of fun to look back, like you said, those 20, 30 years and see that it wasn't a joke, that the generals and the president weren't totally crazy in saying, there is something that we can use to hopefully stop an incoming intercontinental ballistic missile or an ICBM. So,
well, I think the Israelis are pretty glad that technology
aren't they, though?
came along with their Iron Dome.
Yeah, and we're not finished with North Korea. We might be very happy. We've got stuff up in Alaska and, pre-positioned in South Korea and other places like that. So
you were the guy in the day that was putting a magazine on the shelf listing all of these technologies, not just U.S. technologies, but
what we had, what the bad guys had.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about what that meant. You went from being an outdoor writer to high-level detail writer about defense industry.
It was quite a transition, and it was one that you had to hit the ground running. I luckily, had a lot of people that could see value in International Combat Arms Magazine and what we were trying to do, and took me under their wing, and they were the experts. They were the ones that guided me to the writers where I said, didn't do mill speak. Mill speak is that mumbo jumbo, lama lama ding dong language that nobody understands.
Yeah, an acronym for everything.
An acronym for everything. So we were high tech, but not highly technical. And people came away with a thing going, wow, that's something that I think we need in our defense systems. There were other systems that we profiled, and we were not a rubber stamp for the Pentagon. We looked at the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, if you think back to your days when you were in the service, there was a thing out there called the Sergeant York. It was the DVAD. It was a Divisional Air Defense Weapon System. Well, it would either go wham, wham, jam, or it was a system where instead of locking in on a helicopter that was incoming, posing a threat to our troops on the ground, the thing literally locked in on the air conditioning and the fan system of an outhouse about 4 miles away and ended up shooting at it.
So that could be a little inconvenient.
Well, on top of it, it's funny because, we profiled it with, like I said, both those that were in favor of it and those that said, we don't need this. We have not developed the technology that's discerning enough to be able to unfortunately say, what's the difference between an outhouse fan and an incoming Soviet helicopter? So we took the middle of the road. I mean, it was one of those, as Fox News says, we report, you decide.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, so you mentioned I served in the military.
Mm-hmm.
And coincidentally, you and I both have a fair amount of gray hair. We were out there on the ground at the same time.
Yes, sir.
I was in the U.S. Army for the entirety of Ronald Reagan's administration. In fact, I was there when Ronald Reagan stood at the Brandenburger Tor in Berlin and challenged Gorbachev
and made
open
that
this gate.
famous utterance of, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Yeah, so tell me something. I talked to a lot of veterans from that era,
mm-hmm.
and there's almost a kind of nostalgia that creeps in about the good old days of the Cold War we knew.
Well, at least in those days, you knew who the threat was and where the threat was supposedly coming from. Today it has become today's adversary is supposed to be tomorrow's friend and vice versa. And, if you go back to the days of Vietnam War, our soldiers would go into a town or a village and they'd think that they were going to be welcome open-armed, and as soon as the night fell, Charlie came out and the VC was all over them. So it's much the same thing, but it's on an international scale now, Alan. It's not so easy to put a finger on insofar as who's really going to stand with you. And I can see the nostalgia. The lines were pretty well drawn in the sand. Today, I think they're very blurred.
You could see it on a map, at least.
You sure could. Yes, sir.
These days, that's much harder to discern. Well, back in the day then, 1985, I think I've got my date right, as a result of this success that you had with International Combat Arms, you put out a tiny little book. It was the size of a passport.
U.S. passport, right.
It fit in your shirt pocket, called
The Terrorism Survival Guide, 101 Travel Tips on How Not to Become a Victim.
And that's because in those days, terrorism was an up-and-coming thing.
It really
Hijackings, bombings. We'd had Munich
oh, my goodness.
at the Olympics by that time. And so it was on everyone's mind. So tell me,
well, I was traveling so much that I was spending 2 weeks out of every month at the Pentagon and in Washington, D.C., and I was at the White House and up on Capitol Hill and State Department, and then I was also going to places like the Paris Air Show, the Farnborough Air Show. I was visiting defense contractors from Australia, Singapore, all throughout Europe, Germany. In those days, they were developing the multinational fighter for Europe called the Tornado. So because of who we were and our success and our acceptance with the American public, as well as really some of the world, we'd get invited to go. And I had a ball. I mean, I got to fly, float, and drive just about everything in inventory.
Racked up a few miles.
Oh, yes. And I kept seeing the way people were traveling. And I'd keep hearing about the terrorist attacks, the bombings at the airports, the shootings at the hotels, things that people I looked at and I said, they're not traveling right. They got their blinders on. They're not paying attention to what's going on around them. They're basically sheep in a line or a cattle being headed down the trail. And I had a lot of people that I worked with, including contacts with the Mossad and the Israelis. Of course, terrorism was home-based at that point, really, for them. I mean, you know, they think they have problems today. Go back to our time 20, 30 years ago with the bus bombings and the random shootings and suicide bombings and all of that. And I started to just, kind of like what I did with the jerky book, I compiled recipes for insulating yourself better when you put yourself online when you travel, be it for business, be it for fun, be it for whatever.
So you're not talking to military people here or defense industry people. You're talking to the average tourist, the average vacationer.
That is correct.
The average business person that, who can blame them? I mean, up until that point, nobody had to worry about security that much at an airport, really. I mean, so there was a mindset that they just showed up and got on a plane.
I wrote you referenced the book, The Terrorism Survival Guide, which came out with Dell Doubleday Group out of New York. But I originally wrote it as an article for International Combat Arms. I ended up getting phone calls from all sorts of media outlets literally around the world. I did, NHK in Japan, the BBC, all of our own groups here too, saying, wow, nobody's ever put together something that was for the layperson, for the traveler. If you were, Secretary Rumsfeld or something like that, and you had all, your own security force, let somebody else worry about it. But when you get on the road with a suitcase, it's up to you, Bubba.
Sure.
It's up to you.
So that little book did really well. People responded to it.
It did extremely well.
Companies were buying it to hand out to their employees. Why has it taken 25 years for this new book, now called The Terrorism Survival Guide, 201 Travel Tips on How Not to Become a Victim?
Well, part of the reason is because when that book came out, our headline for that year, basically, and that time frame was the downing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. I had the opportunity to actually sit close by to the actor Kirk Douglas right after that Pan Am flight got blown out of the sky. We were on a Pan Am flight. And
was he picking your brains for tips?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, he was. And so was his wife. Yeah. I was honored. I really was. The book, was there as a guide. It wasn't there to scare everybody. But the Dell Publishing Company merged with Doubleday. and they flew me back to New York, and I went before the editorial board, which, with all due respect, had changed completely. The whole genre of what Dell Publishing Company had been was now much more aligned with what I would say was a feminine or female mentality. And they didn't like the book. They didn't like the book at all. They said this wasn't the direction they were going to go now, that they were going to cease publication of it, even though it had gone into multiple printings and was sold, literally was being sold worldwide. I mean, I'd walk into an airport, and see it in the gift store.
Yeah.
So they said it because it wasn't going to happen here. It wasn't going to happen in the United States. Oh my gosh, all you're doing is scaring people. And
so it wasn't really that knowledgeable people took a look around and said the threat had diminished, so we don't really need to sell this book. The book's not selling anymore, so let's just take it out of print. This was an editorial decision.
That is correct. The book was selling very well. Everybody was making good money off of it. And when there was a terrorist incident overseas, which in that point it had been predominantly been that way, they'd still call me and say, okay, what do you think? What can people do? How do I protect myself? What do I tell my listeners, my viewers? I luckily got the deal where I got the rights back from Dell Doubleday. Mm-hmm. That was the impetus that at least I had the core.
And so now we have this new release.
Correct.
But a lot has changed in the world since 1985. The terrorist threat has morphed and morphed again. What is different about the world between the first time you wrote a book advising people how to be safe when they travel and this one? And then we'll get into what's different in this book. But talk to me about the world. How, in your years of paying attention to geopolitics and geosecurity issues, what's different about today?
That right there is an excellent $64 question. How has our world changed? And you're the first one to have ever asked me that. So,
well, let's dig in.
That one is, I don't even have a quick answer logged away in the back of my little pea brain here. Mm-hmm. I would say that it was probably maybe going back to what you were saying earlier, that, your enemy was defined back then. You knew that the Palestinians hated the Israelis. You knew that there were various factions of terrorists that were anti-government, especially in Germany. It was more well-defined that while terrorism was bad, horrible, didn't go the way they wanted it to go with the terrorist against the government, you were more of an ancillary casualty. You may not have been the one that they really wanted. Nowadays, that terrorism picture has so changed. They want everybody. They want an infidel. They want innocent civilians. They want massive body counts. The days of you and I remember them very well. You couldn't pick up a newspaper once a month without there saying, another hijacking.
But those tended to produce very few casualties.
Correct.
At the end of the day.
That is correct.
And so now, not only has the landscape changed in terms of who's out there and what they want.
Bingo.
But modus operandi has changed as well. So now we have things like concert goers.
Yes.
Have to be concerned.
Bikers on New York bike paths, people in shopping malls, people at schools.
Because making a statement simply, it was never simple, I'll rephrase that, just making a statement with a hijacking, drawing a lot of attention to your cause, this seems to be no longer what people are interested in. The end goal is mass casualty.
Who's number one? Yeah, who's number one with the most casualties?
Now, as you think about how to advise people how to exist in that new world, what do you tell people about that? How to protect themselves? Back in the day, it was probably not that hard to notice somebody casing an airport in advance of a hijacking. They generally had some telltales. I was in the security business in that day too.
Yes, sir.
They had telltales. Now, you're just at a concert. You're just riding your bike. You're just out about doing what you do in the world. How do you advise people take the blinders off in this new environment?
You go back historically to what you said, there were telltales, there were signs, there were things that especially trained security people could look for and say, uh-oh, we got a bogey. We got somebody that just looks a little hinky over here. Let's go check him or her out. I think, though, that if you go back then to Israel at that same time, sure, they had all of the troops on the street. They had the Mossad. They had security agencies looking, but they were still being victims of bus bombings and suicide bombings and car bombs and shootings and things like that. And that's kind of what I tried to do is incorporate here, is that if you don't learn from history, you're guaranteed to repeat it. And a lot of these tips are going back, but go back to the common core that you've got to become more aware of surroundings now than you ever did. There's no easy way. I mean, if you're on an airplane and it gets hijacked and they've got box cutters and things like that, you're already to the point where pretty much you're screwed, dude. There's not a lot you can do unless you want to take over the airplane crash and everybody's going to die anyway. But nowadays, the concerts, the shopping malls, everything are those soft targets. And as an American people, we're just not real aware of what's going on around us.
So what you're talking about is a new level of personal responsibility.
Totally.
And I call it new because, as I say, in 1965, you really didn't have to be personally responsible for your security in an airport.
No.
Because those things had really not started happening. Now, though, the situation is different. And so if I've got a plane ticket, I'm putting my family on a plane, we're going on vacation. What are the top 3 or 4 things that I can do to be personally responsible for my own security?
Well, number one, let's start with, where are you going? Where are you sending your family? Where are you going to vacation or business trip? Are you heading to a hot zone? Are you heading to an area there's State Department warnings out there? You go to, statedepartment.gov website, and there is a complete daily updated listing of areas where they're saying either advised, warning, or heck no, don't go there, you dummy.
So do some research.
Yes, absolutely. We didn't have that back when I wrote the first edition of the book. You could go to the State Department's website, even if you had a computer, and the internet in 1985.
Which let's be clear, they didn't. So you could call the State Department on the phone.
You could call the State Department and say, I'm going to Lama Lama Ding Dong Land, what's up? And you might be able to get a security officer or an agent to talk with you or give you a heads up.
But that's different today.
Today, it's instant. Today, you can check. I mean, if an incident happens in Swaziland this morning, it's posted by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, our time.
So there's no excuse for not being aware of the threat environment.
That is what I said then. That's your first tip. Do a little research where you're going. I mean, if you're headed to Peoria, Illinois, I don't think you have to worry about it too much. But, not only is it a hotbed of where you're going, what's going on while you're there? Are you going for, the International Socialist Worker Party's convention? You're probably not, but do you know if it's actually going on at the same time? I mean, look at the headlines today. A dictator, Mugabe, in Zimbabwe, has been taken down, is under house arrest. You can bet if you got on the State Department's website right now, you'd be finding that there are a lot of warnings because they've already told all Americans, shelter, hunker down in place. Don't even think about trying to go to the airport and get out of there.
So it doesn't matter if your ticket was prepaid. Just don't go.
Suck it up, Buttercup.
All right, so we've got the threat assessment. We've got the cultural environment. Mm-hmm. What festivals, what protests are going on. Mm-hmm. What else?
I would say after that, there's a lot of tips about, how do you travel? How do you pack? But, if you want to stay with the family side of it, once you get there, how do you present yourself? Can I spot you as an American a mile away? Or do you blend in? Do you not look like the typical tourist and traveler? where are you staying? If you're going to the Hilton, the Marriott, the Hyatt, or one of the big buck affiliates, well, then guess what? You've already pre-identified yourself for me as the bad guy. You got money, buddy.
If I'm looking for Americans to mess with, I know where to go.
I know where you're going to go. So you may want to have toned that down. You're not staying at the big dollar grand hotels, and not just an American affiliate too. In fact, in the first book, I ticked off a lot of the hotel chains, because I said this may not be where you want to stay. Well, they didn't like me in my book very much, but it's the truth. Every country has their own sets of what you would consider to be the big high dollar 5-star hotels. If you've got it and can flaunt it and you want to stay there, okay. But if you're like most of us, you don't spend a lot of time in your hotel room anyway. You're going out on the street, you're seeing the sights, you're taking care of business. Maybe you should have worked with or done a little more research and said, stay at the one 6 blocks away, right. where they're not going to attack the hotel in Manila, in Kuala Lumpur, in Bali, which are easy and they're concrete. They're not going to move. So the bad guy knows where they're at. Bad guy can case them.
So let's suppose I've done all of that. I've done my research. I've figured out how to blend in a little bit better in the culture. While I'm there, in spite of everything, something goes down. Now, how would you advise me?
Okay, well, again, before you left, you've registered with the State Department. They know you, Mrs. Allen, and all the little Allens are there. They can send you an instant message now on your phone telling you and advising you. In the old days, you had to get into country. You had to go to the embassy or the consulate, and you had to register. And you say, hi, I'm here, my family's here, this is where we're staying, this is what we're doing, and hopefully they could call the hotel. Duh. I mean, cell phones were not really there back then, and try to advise you, either get out, shelter in place, something like that. Nowadays, before you leave, weeks before you leave, you register and say, I'm going to be in Berlin, Amsterdam, Venice, and Paris for this duration and time frame. Here's my dates of travel. Something happens, they can alert you immediately. If you're not a witness to it and you're out having fun and somebody blows up the hotel or attacks the consulate or the embassy while you're out, you've got an opportunity to make other plans. Don't go back into the area. It's a hot zone. Stay away.
So a lot of people would say, wow, I've just invited, Big Brother to know every step of my vacation. What's the justification? What would you say to somebody like that who's a little worried about?
You're paranoid. You're paranoid. Keep in mind, there are hundreds of thousands of American travelers every day in foreign countries. The State Department is offering it as a service, not as oh boy, I've got a way now I can start tracking everybody. Forget it. It doesn't work that way. In fact, I admire them that they're able to keep up with just protecting you and I and your family while traveling into these areas.
So you say they've got other things to do besides look over your shoulder.
Totally. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. But it's up to you, and it's voluntary. You're not automatically registered once you buy that ticket to Paris. I mean, you are, because of the fact that they're going to look at you, and that's Homeland Security, and that's the travel and TSA and all of that. But once you get there, adios, amigo. If you want to stay underground and just enjoy on your own, don't worry about it.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the Think Radio community of patrons, visit alanwartismedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
All right, so let's shift gears, because we've been talking so far mostly about foreign travel. I'm buying a ticket to somewhere that may or may not be a hot spot. It's up to me to figure it out. But most Americans today, because of our recent news history, are more worried about things going down here. And these are not the car bombings. We haven't had those yet. Knock on wood.
I was just about to look at you and say, yeah, okay, yet is a key word.
Let's go ahead and agree to pretend that we're not going to have those here. But what we do have are the concert shootings. We have automobiles as weapons. We have people walking into churches. This seems to be an entirely different thing. How do you prepare for something like that? And I'm sure you get this question. You're still a media consultant. People are still calling you on the phone when one of these events takes place, and they want to know, Andy, from your point of view, with all your years of gathering expertise, what do we tell people about this kind of incident?
It's difficult to give specifics because each one of these incidents is in and of themselves different. I mean, you can look at it and say you can start by maybe trying to categorize. And I use what they call the 3 C's of terrorism. You've got a crusader, you've got a criminal, and you've got a crazy. What we're seeing more and more of here domestically at this point is we're not dealing with a crusader. We're dealing with somebody that is either revenge/criminality and or a Looney Tune. You know, you've got nuts out there.
And from a security industry point of view, that's much more difficult.
Oh, my God.
Because crusaders have an MO. They have certain things that are pretty typically...
They're going to leave a track record. I mean, all of these things that we see, especially in the foreign nations, they should have been on somebody's radar if they weren't. But then when they go back and look and they go, yep, we blew it. We should have seen the red flags. These people that are the church, the bikeway, the schools in California, which happened just recently, much more difficult to pin down. The concerts, maybe there should have been people that had those specific individuals on their radar, but they didn't. You asked me what was different then compared to now in our country. We've become so much more concerned about individual rights, individual freedoms, political correctness, that even if we're living next door to a nut hut, we're hesitant to pick up the phone and call somebody and say, yo-ho, you need to check this guy or these people out. So we also are faced with the fact that if you look at historically, and I tried to do a little bit of research in preparation for your show today, that we have such a small fraction of mental institutions today as compared to our day, back in the 80s and things, where people could get picked up and they could put you under psych evaluation for 72 hours and they would have more funding. Now, I'm not going to go political on you, but I certainly think our mental health industry, what we face here in the United States, has gone from whatever level you want to call it back in the 80s and the 90s to here in the 21st century, dismal, and the results are showing it. You've got more people that are out there that are not only a danger to themselves, they're a danger to everyone, and they're a danger to you.
Yeah, well, and Andy, you say you don't want to go political, but you really can't talk about terrorism without talking about politics. And you can't talk about this threat without discussing our cultural environment that has enabled it. And so I think you're making valid points there. The state of mental health in general in the society has decayed.
Dismal.
But the state of mental health care is dismal. But let's go back to something that you said just a moment ago about picking up the phone, see something, say something, all of that campaign. Back in my days in the military, I was a counterintelligence special agent, so these were things that I thought about on a professional level.
24/7.
I know how difficult it is, but there is the question of civil liberties hanging out there. There is the slippery slope that cultures frequently get on where they sacrifice too much in order to secure public places or to control the flow of information. In your opinion...
Well, you can roll this whole thing over even into the Second Amendment and the gun debate and personal protection and, the slippery slope of your rights versus her rights not to want a gun and blah, blah, blah.
So how do you handle that question then, the balance, the delicate balance between civil liberties and securing the society?
I don't handle it very well. I really don't, because I see us going slippery slope. I've been to countries, nations, where they have given up so much of their personal liberties, their privacy, that again, I look and I say 30 years ago, oh, that would never happen here. That would never happen here. Well, as we both know, it's a different world out there today. It is cause for concern. But by the same token, if the shooter that was in California just recently killed his wife, put her under the floorboards of his house, and then took off on a random shooting spree, had been reported to the police numerous times. That this guy is a freak. He's a fanatic. He's out there shooting guns at midnight and into the air. He's a horrible person, blah, blah, blah. Well, hello, if that's not a red flag, I don't know what is. And yet the cops couldn't do anything. But I believe his sister or a relative stepped forth and said his mental health issues in the last year have become so acute, delusional, literally crazy. And yet nobody would do anything.
Few treatment options.
Yeah.
We have no funding stream, no infrastructure in place to really deal with that.
No. And that's oftentimes why, if you want to take it a step further to gun and a protection of yourself, that's why some of these people, a lot of them are falling through the cracks. They're not being reported as a threat or as a danger, and they're out there securing firearms, and personally, I'd rather have the good guy with the gun rather than the bad guy with the gun.
Well, so we've talked a lot about the history of terrorism, how it's changed in the years since you've been paying attention. I think most people would divide history into two, pre-9/11 and post. What's your opinion about that? How big of a global game changer was that event?
Total.
In what ways?
It brought it home. Where I sat a few blocks from the World Trade Center at Dell Publishing Company and listened to an editorial board of 6 women say, "You're scaring people. We don't want to scare people. It's never going to happen here. It always happens someplace else." Well, 9/11 was that game changer. It did happen here. My sources that I still liaison with and talk with on a regular basis and share information say the American public really, again, is naive, because you have no idea all these security agencies that have been out there working since 9/11, how many other attacks they've actually stopped.
Why don't we hear about those?
Because
we hear about them
we're
once in a
tipping
while.
our hand. We're tipping our hand that we either have on the ground, infiltration, electronic eavesdropping, information gathering systems and ways, much better intercooperation worldwide with other nations post 9/11. But yeah, they don't want to talk about it. They're kind of like the SEAL teams that go in, do it, get out, be done.
So as you look forward now from this time, what worries you the most?
Probably 2 angles. Now that ISIS, which is the latest threat, the Al-Qaeda kind of slipped, down a little bit priority-wise. But now that the ISIS group has been displaced in Syria, in Iraq, Raqqa, Mosul, things like that, where they're being pushed out, well, they're not like slime that just goes down the drain. They've been pushed out. They're slime now that is going and infiltrating other areas. I got an interesting report day before yesterday where an area that I see as a concern is the country of France again. And the reason is because they believe so many of the ISIS fighters, those that had pledged loyalty, allegiance, etc., are infiltrating back into France within the last year. And go back to France with the editorial cartoon shooting and then the concert again. They believed that they had about 7,500 ISIS radicalized supporters at that time in country. Oh my God, that's a huge number just to begin with. Mm-hmm. Today, they estimate that it may be as high as 18,000.
So
it's more than doubled.
Is this an issue that can ever be solved then? We talk about fighting the war on terror. Is this something that's simply a part of reality in the 21st century?
I tell everybody I think that's way above my pay grade, and you'll know how I can relate to that with you. But from just an outside observer, there is no easy fix. This is what I try to stress in the book, is that it's going to come back down to you to protect your family, to be aware of your surroundings, what's going on, see something, say something. If you've got a nut that lives across the street from you, and your wife is going, no, I don't want to impose. By the same token, you go to a concert or something and it's 85, 90 degrees and we're all in short sleeve shirts, and this person is bundled up with robes and a pull down ski mask, mumbling, sweating profusely and running beads through his hand. Maybe you ought to say something. There's not going to be an easy fix. We live in a different world than you and I did 30 years ago. Go back to your mom and dad. We lived in a different world than what they did. Mm-hmm. This, unfortunately, to me, is a reality that's not going to go away.
So learning how to take responsibility for yourself is a fairly important...
Yeah. I mean, it's like when somebody breaks into your house. Everybody doesn't want to see a cop until they need one. And it's, and how come you weren't there to help me? Mm-hmm. Well, same thing translates over into the world of travel, terrorism, protecting yourself, being able to take responsibility and say, I can't rely on the government. I can't rely on airport security all the time. And I can travel smarter, or I can do what the terrorist wants me to do, and that is give up my right to that free travel. There's so many countries out there where people would just give up everything if they had the right for free travel like what we have here in the United States. And while many say that's a privilege, to me, I say that's a right. And I don't want the terrorists to win by stopping me and my family and my company from being able to do what we've always done. We just have to do it better.
All right, so one last question then. Same as the last one. I asked you what worries you the most as you look forward. Where do you find reason for optimism? That we're safer, we're learning, we're growing as a society, we're learning how to deal with this new environment. Is there reason to be optimistic that things are improving?
Limited optimism, not overwhelmingly optimistic. We've still not had the giant mall shootings with the car bombings. We've not had a repeat of a 9/11. We're still infants in diapers here in the United States by comparison to other countries where it's been a way of life for decades, 50 years or longer. I'm afraid we are still very much a soft target. And it's going to come down to you and me being alert, being attuned to what's going on around us, and hoping that we're not in the wrong place at that wrong time.
All right, Andy. Well, the Terrorism Survival Guide, 201 travel tips on how not to become a victim. It's out on the shelves now. Where do people find it?
Oh, it's on Amazon. It's in major booksellers, well, literally throughout the nation. Skyhorse Publishing Company is a major New York publishing company. And I understand that there's recently was a pretty nice size order, but it was overseas. It was an overseas. And I did a little research, and I think they're going to England. So
Well,
we will see, but the book thus far is doing very well. It's selling well. My little Amazon star rating looks to be pretty high, and I'm a happy camper about that. But you know what? I didn't write the book again for the money. I wrote it because I looked at all of the other books that were out there, and we went back to the Soldier of Fortune, the James Bond. I could carry mace, I can smuggle a knife in my shoe and protect her. I didn't see anything out there where my goal was, and even why I wrote the first book, if I could keep one person safe or one family from becoming a victim, then I was a success. And I know that.
Well, I know you'll understand what I mean when I say I hope the day comes when you don't sell another copy of this book.
Amen, brother.
Because no one needs to be concerned.
That's right. That's right. I don't think we'll see that in our lifetime, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And like I said, and if I can take all of my time, expertise, contacts, and compile all of this where you don't have to run around and do it, just sit down and thumb through the book before you take off on your next big trip and say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't think about that one.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well,
then it's a winner.
Andy, best of luck, and Amazon.com. Go buy a copy. Thanks for joining me.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. The show's associate producer is Kat Seibert. Music by Issa Forrest. You've been listening to Think Radio on KWSB FM 91.1 in Gunnison, Colorado, from the campus of Western State Colorado University. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.